All right. All right, welcome back. So we are well into our fourth week, and the topic for the next couple of weeks will be JavaScript, as you well know, and this will include the topics that are listed here with the client-side development module, which basically the three large topics are JavaScript in general, jQuery, and then AngularJS. So we did talk about JavaScript in general last lecture, and today I'd like to go a little further and talk about jQuery. And then next week we'll spend the whole week talking about AngularJS. Right? So in our previous lecture we talked about JavaScript, and basically that is the native language that is supported by most browsers, and as I hinted at last lecture, there's different versions of browsers, different vendors, and they're all competing against each other. Some of them follow the spec very closely. Some of them add certain features that other browsers don't have, and this just makes it harder on the developer having to handle or support various versions of browsers, right? Different versions of the language, different and we can't guarantee what browser, right? We can't impose what browser to use that the user is going to use for our application. If these are web applications that are meant to be used maybe internally within a corporation, maybe you can impose certain restrictions, right? If it's inward facing, right? Or maybe these are admin people, right? Users. If it's a small population, maybe you can impose certain restrictions, right? We're going to target certain versions of IE, certain versions of Chrome, Safari, and whatnot. But when you're talking about applications that are meant to be used worldwide and by a much wider audience, you can't control that, right? So you have to design your application to be useful in various use cases. And we hinted at last class that this is very challenging, right? A lot of that code that turns out to be a lot of if statements, a lot of if else statements, a lot of switch case statements, right? That detect one browser and do it one way, detect another browser, do it another way. It's just a nightmare to write, nightmare to maintain. So to solve that big problem, a library that the jQuery library solves this problem by basically centralizing this one big huge switch case statement into one library, right? So instead of you having to do all these checks depending on the versions of the browser, jQuery does it for you, right? And builds on top of the low-level JavaScript support, right? It builds on top of that many more features, right? Many more behaviors. It creates a standard event handling mechanism. It also builds a predictable, well thought out API for being able to manipulate and interact with the DOM, right? And lots and lots of plugins and widgets that add that make it easy for us developers to create all sorts of very interesting and dynamic interactive applications. There's quite a few videos here on jQuery that I definitely encourage you to go over. It shows you how to download or link to the jQuery library, and then how to initialize it from within your HTML pages. In jQuery, we're going to look at two basic pieces of jQuery. I mean, it's huge, right? We're not going to have a chance to cover all of it, but at least I would say the parts that really matter and that will give you a chance to then later on explore on your own. But the one that we're going to look at is the core jQuery library. How to install it, how to interact with the DOM, how to do some event handling, perhaps connect to backend services with Ajax. So that's a core jQuery that we'll cover today. And then we'll talk about jQuery UI that builds on top of jQuery to create all sorts of very dynamic, very interactive behaviors, such as being able to drag and drop, be able to create certain widgets, such as the date widget, accordions, being able to reorder elements, very, very interesting behaviors. So that we'll talk about jQuery UI as well. So today I hope to be able to cover these two topics. Perhaps it'll spill over to the next lecture next week when we'll start talking about AngularJS. So jQuery basically is the it's a higher level programming framework, right, that hides all the details of JavaScript. And so it builds on top this layer, right, this abstraction layer, so that you no longer code directly to JavaScript, but you code to the jQuery API. Underneath, obviously, it's all JavaScript, right? And the way it does it is that jQuery, when you load the jQuery library, basically it defines one global function, the jQuery function. It's just one very interesting, very powerful function that is very, very smart, and it knows how to behave in different ways depending on the context, right? So if you give it a string, it'll behave one way. If you give it a function, it'll behave differently. So it's just a function, right? But depending on what you pass it, right, it behaves one way or another. So for instance, if you give it a string, well, it'll parse that string, and depending on what you put in that string, it also behaves differently. Okay. If, for instance, if you give it a CSS rule, then it understands it, interprets it as in, oh, you want to interact with the DOM, right? You want to grab something from the DOM, very much like what CSS rules do, right? That's what CSS rules do, right? They match, right? They match a CSS rule, right, using dots and elements and IDs and classes, right? And it matches it against transformations that you want to do, right? That you would declare either in the style tag, or you would declare in a CSS file, right? Well, in jQuery, you can use these same CSS3 rules, right, to refer to pieces in the HTML document, right? To grab pieces of the document, and then it allows you to then interact with it. You can once you grab it using the jQuery function, using this string, this CSS rule, you can then start interacting with it. You can remove it, right? You can clone it, right? You can manipulate it. You can change its style, right? You can assign event handlers. You can do all sorts of things, right? But the first part is the interesting part is being able to grab and refer, right, to the DOM, right, using something as familiar as CSS rules, right? Something that we already covered, right? You use dots, right, to use classes, right? You use hash signs to refer to use IDs, right? Or you use just plain old element names, right? Element names to refer to, or you can use spaces and greater than, or to be able to refer to specific elements, right, in the DOM. So we'll look at that first. The other part of that string that you pass to jQuery, the jQuery function, is if you pass it a well-formed HTML snippet, right, it will actually create, right, it will create the DOM, right, without actually putting it in the existing DOM. It will create a memory, a DOM element in memory, right, which you can manipulate programmatically and then add it to the DOM when you're done. So for instance, if you pass it, less than UL greater than, right, as a string, it'll understand that, oh, you're giving me an HTML element, right? You're not trying to grab anything from the DOM. You're actually creating a new DOM element, right? right? If you actually give it well-formed HTML, okay, as opposed to a CSS rule, right? So again, it parses the string and it figures out what you mean, right? And then you can dynamically generate new contents to add to the existing DOM. Okay. So yeah, so let's dive in, and here are a couple of examples, and let's quickly go through them. Right. All right. So yeah, so the first example here is just illustrating how you would get started on using jQuery. Right. So the first thing you would do is either download jQuery, right? The library itself, you can download jQuery, or better yet, you can link to a CDN that is hosting the file for you. So you don't download it and host it yourself on your server, right? You rely on someone else hosting it for you, right? Someone who perhaps has a much better record at staying up, right? At maintaining servers, maintaining those servers ready to go. So yeah, so you can download it from here. Okay, no. Wait. Gets the URLs wrong. We can go to jQuery.com. That's the homepage of the project. Okay. It's open source. You can look at the source code, right? You can participate. You can help out, right? That'd be that would look awesome on your resume if you participate in one of these open source projects, right? Perhaps get started with some simple stuff, but any of these open source projects, right? There's tons of them. If you get involved with the community, right? That's definitely a huge bonus on your resume if you've participated in any of these open source projects. But anyway, so here we have jQuery, and you can either download it, and if you download it, you'll notice that there's two versions, right? There's a 1x and a 2x version. They're both basically the same, right? They provide the same functionality, right? But the 1x version, excuse me, still supports older browsers, right? So it has quite a bit of additional code that is for legacy browsers, right? So it still supports IE6 and all the way to IE6, 7, and 8, whereas the jQuery 2x, right, drop support for those older browsers, right? So it's strictly for HTML5 browsers and more modern browsers. Okay, the functionality is the same, right? Other than there might be some certain things you might have to take care if you are trying to support older browsers, right? Anyway, you can download it from here, or you can use Bower, right? We showed you in the previous lecture, right? You can install it by saying Bower install jQuery. This will download jQuery and install it under Bower components. Or better yet, you can link to a CDN, right? And I believe this is one of them. There it is, right? There's the CDN, which is being hosted. Notice that it's minified, right? It's a minified version, so this is not meant to be readable by human beings. Right? It has been, it has been scrunched up, right? All the variables have been reduced to single character variables. All the white space has been removed. Again, this is all to minimize download time of these libraries. Once you download it, you can. I certainly encourage you to take a look at the API documentation. The documentation is wonderful, right? It's tons of examples. It's very, very thorough, and the community is great. It's got tons and tons of plugins that people are, members are always, making available for free. It's a wonderful community to participate. Also here available here is a jQuery UI off of this website, and this we'll cover a little later. We'll cover it maybe in the second half of this this class. But here as well, there are several interactions which we're going to be looking at together today. Some widgets like accordions, autocomplete, buttons, date pickers, progress bars, sliders, spinners, tabs. All components are very useful for creating user interfaces. Okay. Again, all these libraries really attest to the fact that developers have realized that that the web is a legitimate development framework. Okay, it's no longer for static content. There's people are more and more are demanding their applications to be very dynamic, very responsive. What we already expect from desktop applications, right? So if I can do this on a desktop, why can't I do it on a web page, right? Why there's no need to refresh and whatnot. So and certainly all these components help create these applications. All right, so let's take a look at some of the examples that we have here. Right, so here in this example, what it basically says is that the main the main task of jQuery is to interact dynamically with the DOM, right? To manipulate it, right? To either, like the name suggests, to query, right? Meaning retrieve something from the DOM, right? And then manipulate it, change it, right? Do something with it. But the DOM, right, is created by who? The browser creates the DOM, right? The browser downloads the HTML, yes, parses the text, right, basically a text file, yes, and out of the this text file, it generates this model, this object model in RAM, yes. Now this takes time, right? It needs to download, and as it's parsing, the document is not yet ready to be manipulated. Okay, so jQuery needs a mechanism to be notified at saying, hey, let me know when the document has actually, when is the document ready for manipulation, right? Before then, right, it's useless to write any code that tries to grab something from the DOM because the DOM doesn't exist yet. Okay, so it needs a mechanism to be notified on when the DOM is ready for manipulation. Okay, so to do that, first of all, notice here there's a $sign. Right? In jQuery, you'll see lots of $signs. Right? Well, the $sign is an alias to the jQuery function I mentioned earlier. Remember, jQuery declares a global function, the jQuery function. It's global; you can call it from anywhere. But us developers were lazy, and we're always looking to save on a few keystrokes here and there. So we have an alias, the $sign alias, that we can use instead of the jQuery function, but it behaves the same way. So here's the jQuery function right here. Instead of the jQuery function, we use the $sign alias. And as I mentioned earlier, this function is very smart, right? It behaves differently depending on what we give it, right? I already mentioned the fact that if we give it a string, right, it means that you want to interact with the DOM, right? You want to either grab something from the DOM that already exists, or you want to generate something new that you want to put into the DOM. Instead, if we give it a function as an argument, I notice that it says $main. See that? We are giving it the name of a function that already exists. Right? Notice the function down here says function main. Right? Notice that we're giving the main function as an argument to the $sign function. Right? And if we do that, then the behavior is the jQuery, the way it interprets it is that, oh, you want me to wait until the DOM is fully loaded, okay? Once the DOM is loaded, then I will call this function, right? Notifying you, basically, it's like a callback, right? let me know when the DOM is ready, then call me, and then I'll start my program. Make sense? Right? So basically, you put your code, your jQuery program in here in this function. Right? The name of the function can be anything. Doesn't really need to be main. It could be whatever you want. Right? It could be init, start, or whatever. Okay. Obviously not jQuery, right? Because jQuery is already taken. It's a function. If you write a jQuery function, you are basically overriding, right, the jQuery function that jQuery defines, right? So be careful there. You'll also see in some of the documentation and some of the examples out there on the web that instead of having this function separately out here, you'll see that in many examples, you see that the function itself is within the parentheses, inside of the parentheses itself. Okay, basically, creating an inline function, right? An anonymous function, a function that doesn't need a name anymore, right? Because it gets called, it's declared inside of the parentheses, meaning, remember that we mentioned earlier that functions in JavaScript, right? They behave just like any other variable, right? You can pass them around as parameters or as arguments to functions, just like you pass a number or string or date or any object. Well, functions too. Functions can be passed around as such. So you will see often that this function here that is instead of declaring it outside, it's within the parentheses itself. Right, and since we declare it inside of the parentheses, there's no need for a name for the function anymore. It's an anonymous function, right? And some object-oriented developers, feel this is a disturbing syntax, of having these anonymous functions being passed around. I believe this is a better syntax, right? Even though main is not meant to be called by anyone else, right? But the $, it actually makes it much more clearer what's happening here, right? That there's a function being declared, and then it's being called by the jQuery function, right? It makes it much more readable. Okay. All right. So basically, in our example, the code basically what it does is that here's the code, right? Basically what it does is that we have a function in it, right? And it's being called when the document loads, and that function, what does it do? It's something simple. It just says hello. Right? And that's why when you refresh the page, right, it just says hello. Right? When the document is done loading, it runs that code. And now we know that jQuery is actually alive and well, that it's running. Okay, make sense? Any questions? All right. All right, so let's go on to the next example, main. So we mentioned. Notice that the example we just looked at, the source, the JavaScript source was inside of the script tag, or the script element, and we mentioned earlier that it's a bad practice, right? That we should instead have it in a separate file, right? So one of the things that we're doing here is that we're linking the application elsewhere, right? We have the source code in a separate file, main.js or app.js or whatever, right? And then we link it using the script tag and using the source src, and then putting the URL to where that file lives. Okay, so that's one thing we should do. The next thing we should do, right, is that make use of the immediately invoke function expression that we mentioned earlier, right? Instead of declaring functions like main, like we did earlier, we might have lots of functions, lots of variables, and lots of data, right? We should use good practice and hide all this in a namespace, right? In a namespace that is not going to litter the global namespace, right? So we we talked about this in an earlier lecture about using modules, right? Using the module design pattern, right? And the immediately invoked function expression, or IFE, IFE, often referred to as IFEs, as the IFE design pattern. And the way it works is that we declare an anonymous function, right? And wrap it around parentheses, right, as an argument. And then we have a opening closing parentheses at the end. That basically what it does is that it executes, right? That parentheses at the end says execute, right? This is a function, execute it immediately. So whatever it's in there, whatever you put, whatever code you put in there, it executes immediately, right? So so your event handler that gets called when the document loads would all go in there, right? So your $ in it, your init function, your main function, all that would go in there, right? And whatever functions you declare in there would be local, right? These would all have within the namespace. It would not litter the global namespace. Make sense? Also, I believe this is writing something to the console, right? We had introduced the console earlier. Notice that we wrote to the console here. It says hello jQuery. Notice that it didn't do an alert. Instead, it's writing to the console. Right? Most browsers will have a JavaScript console. Right? You can bring it up. If you're on Safari, you might need to specifically initialize it or make it available. I think it's in the preferences, advanced, and then it says show web tools or something like that, or developer tools. Right? If you do that, then you'll have access to the console, so you can use the console as a debugging tool. Right? You can step through the code. You can put breakpoints. You can view the variables. Right? And it's a very nice debugging tool. Here, and you can write to the console by using console.log. So for instance, this hello jQuery was written using console.log. We can look at the source here. Did I have it a separate file? Yes, here it is. Here's main. Oh, excuse me. So yeah, so there it is. We're using the immediately invoked function, right? And our $ in it is all within here. Okay, and it's not littering the namespace. It's exactly the same code we had earlier, right? It's just that we wrapped the immediately invoked function in there. All right. Okay. So this is a design pattern that I would like to see you use, right? When in the next assignment, when you start using JavaScript, right? Avoid littering the namespace, right? Especially because we're going to start using lots of libraries, right? And each library is going to add their own things to the global space, right? When we look at Angular, Angular declares its own Angular object, right? jQuery adds jQuery, right? Underscore adds a whole bunch of other stuff, right? So all these libraries add things. You should avoid competing with these other libraries. Okay. All right. Oops. Okay, so let's see. Let's go to HTML. So HTML, the HTML example just gives you an example on interacting with the HTML document, right? With the DOM, right? One of the easiest ways to manipulate the DOM is to use the .html function, right? But first, before we get to that, let me show you the source code to this. All right, first, let's look at the source, the page source, and you'll notice you'll notice here that here we have, dynamically change HTML content, the H2. Here's my paragraph. And notice that this lorem ipsum, yes, see that? It's not there. Right? It's not in the original HTML document. It's not there, right? Instead, we put a placeholder, right? We put a P, a paragraph, and we gave it a unique ID. Right? We called it lorem, right? And we dynamically injected content in there, right, using jQuery. Right? You'll also notice that down below, we have here a URL over here, item 1, 2, and 3. But down below, notice that there is no such URL. Right? Instead, we have a placeholder. We have div, right? We have a unique ID HTML. You see that? So both of these pieces of content were added dynamically by jQuery. Right? So let's see how we can do that. So let's remember the IDs, right? ID HTML and lorem, right? Because we're going to refer to that from jQuery. Right? So let's look at it's this over here, right? Can I break it into 3 pieces? Maybe. So this is the HTML, right? And this is the JavaScript. So you'll notice that the JavaScript, right? It's well formed, right? Notice that it's inside of a immediately invoked function expression, right? So it's not littering the namespace. It's declaring a function that as an initializer. And in there, notice that we have the $. We're using the $. Again. Remember, the first $, notice that we're passing a function, yes? That says, hey, notify me when the document is done. I will call this function when it's done, and then you can initialize and do everything. So that's, okay, so once the document is done, init gets called. And in there, notice we have 2 lines of code. We only have 2 lines of code. The first line of code, it says $, and then a string, right? That string, notice that it has a hash in front of it, and then lorem. That lorem is that ID, right? It's the ID from HTML. And if you notice, that's a CSS rule. See that? It's the same syntax that you would use in the style tag, right? Or in a CSS file, right? It uses a well-formed, right? It uses a CSS3 specification, right, to refer to elements of the document, right? This is where jQuery gets its name, query, right? If you're in SQL, right? SQL is a syntax. It has a syntax that allows you to refer, right, to tables, right, or refer to fields, right, in a database, correct? Right, using a syntax, select and then fields from tables, right, where and so on and so forth. Yes, right. So where you can provide, entities where you get tables where you're retrieving, fields where you're retrieving, and then some criteria, where age is greater than so on and so forth, right? Right. So jQuery allows you to do the same thing, right? That syntax, that string in there that we're providing jQuery allows you to query the document, right? Just like select in SQL allows you to pattern match what matches in the database and retrieve the data, right? jQuery allows you to do the same thing, but using a different syntax, using the CSS syntax, right? You provide your selectors there, your criteria, and then once you have it, once it retrieves it from the DOM, then you can do all sorts of things, right? You can do all sorts of things by calling methods on it, calling methods on whatever it is that you're retrieving. Here we're retrieving hash lorem, which in the code refers to this paragraph over here, right? This paragraph. So this $lorem refers to this paragraph over here. Okay, so now in the code I have that paragraph. Okay, now I have the paragraph. What do you want to do with that paragraph? Okay, now that you have the paragraph, we can say dot and then a whole bunch of functions. There's a whole bunch of functions that we can call on, right? One of the simplest one, the easiest one is called .html. And what do you think .html function does, right? It allows you to manipulate whatever the HTML content is of that element you grabbed, right? Since we're grabbing the paragraph, we can now manipulate the HTML content of that paragraph. So what are we doing? We're passing a string, and we're saying, I want this to be the HTML content. Okay? And that's how, right, that's how lorem ipsum makes it into the DOM. See that? Right? Now, most functions, most jQuery functions have two versions, right? So here, we're looking at the version that allows us to write, right? To write to the DOM, right? To put stuff in the DOM. Right? You provide an argument, right? And that argument is used to manipulate the DOM, right? But most functions have another different version, the one that takes no arguments. Okay, so instead, if we use the same .html but no arguments, what it does instead is that it retrieves the DOM, right? It reads the HTML content of the paragraph. Okay, so it has a read and a write version. If you provide arguments, I will write to the DOM. If you don't provide arguments, it will read from the DOM. Right? So you can retrieve the HTML content of a paragraph, right? If we don't provide an arguments. Right? Here's the second one down below. Notice that it says $hash HTML. So this one down here. Okay. If you remember, HTML, right, is the ID of this div over here, right? Since it's a hash, then it must be that, like the CSS rules syntax says, is that we must be referring to the ID HTML. Yes, that's what hash means, right? It's the ID. So yeah, so certainly it's referring to this this element that has that ID. So I'm referring to that div. Now that I have the div, what are we doing? Notice that we are providing not just plain HTML, not plain text like we did earlier. Yes, we are providing, right, well-formed HTML content. Notice that we're providing a UL, an LI, a couple LIs actually, 3 LIs, right? Item 1, item 2, and item 3. Right? And what this does, it dynamically creates a UL node, and then it creates 3 LI nodes, right? And they're appended inside of the UL, right? So if we actually look at the DOM, well, first of all, notice that they are well rendered, right? So it looks like it works, right? That it created a list. But if we look at the DOM, we'll see that indeed, that's what the browser understood, right? The browser understood that this is a UL element and it has 3 LIs in there, right? Remember that this inspector, this browser inspector that allows us to look at the elements, right? This is the DOM interpretation of the document, right? These ULs were not originally in the text, in the HTML text. Instead, they were dynamically generated using jQuery, right? So we use jQuery to successfully dynamically insert DOM nodes. Make sense? Right? Again, we saw there's another testament to the power of jQuery, right? These functions are very smart. Depending on what you give it, it interprets it correctly, right? If you give it a plain string, right, then it behaves one way. If you give it well-formed HTML, it's even smarter, right? It understands that you want to create this DOM snippet, right, and use that as the HTML content of the div. Notice a div, right? Here's a div, the HTML div, right? And inside you have the UL. Pretty cool. Okay. All right. Let's look at another one, append. Append, it's more or less the same idea as HTML, but it's a little more nuanced, right? It's a little more powerful, right? It allows you to target, in narrower pieces of the DOM. Okay, so append builds a model and says, I don't want to replace the entire content of whatever it is that I'm grabbing. Instead, I want to add something to it. Maybe there's already content in there, right? I just want to add to it, right? As in you have a collection of pieces of HTML elements, but I just want to add to it. So for instance, if I already have a well-formed UL with a whole bunch of line items, yes, instead of just throwing away the content and just replacing it with new content, right? That's what HTML does, right? HTML basically, if you have already HTML content in there, I'm going to replace it with new HTML content. Instead, append, what it does is that it, like the name suggests, right? It adds to already existing content, right? So if I already have a UL with lots of items, I can add new items at the end, at the bottom, right? The default is to add at the bottom, but you can there is also an add at the beginning as well. You can prepend. You can append at the end. You can prepend at the beginning, or even in the middle. You can say you can give an index and say, oh, I want to insert as a third element of a a 10 item set of elements. Right? So you can be very nuanced on where you want to put exactly the new content. Okay. So let's look at this this example. So here's simple append. You can append several elements, or you can prepend at the beginning. Let's look at the source code here. So first, let's look at the source code for this page. And we'll notice, oops, wait. We'll notice that, first of all, this hello world is not there, right? It's not there. We do have a placeholder, right? And we could have done this with plain old HTML. We could have done this with plain old HTML, right? But I just want to show you that with append, you can do whatever HTML does, plus a whole bunch of other stuff. Okay. So it's not there. Let's look at this append down below. Notice that we have here in the original document. Notice that we only had 3 elements, LIs here. So you notice that we had Java, Node, and C#. But notice that we have 2 additional elements that were not in the original HTML. See that? Well, we're going to achieve that by using, again, append, right? So the DOM only has these 3, the original 3 LIs. We're going to dynamically add 2 more. Or notice down below, notice prepend. Prepend had an empty list of students. See that? It was empty, but then dynamically we added these 4. Okay, let's see how we could do that. Okay, so let's make this a little smaller. And the code is elsewhere. That's over here. Okay, there it is. Okay, okay. First of all, again, all the code is inside of an immediately invoked function, right? And this is what I would expect from your code, right? So don't have global functions, right? Just spread all over the place, right? Instead, protect them inside of a namespace, please. So what are we doing here? We are calling init, and the first thing we do is we grab a hold of the ID of this hello ID right here, right? We grab that. So this over here is referring to this ID over here, and what do? We append and just say hello world, right? This does exactly the same thing as HTML, right? It grabs the content and then the text that you give it, and then just adds to the paragraph, right? But unlike HTML, right? This is adding to something that's already there, right? Right now it's empty, right? So that when we add to empty, we just get hello world. But if we keep calling that append, right? New content is just added, more and more to the end of this paragraph. Okay. Right. So and we can. So for instance, I can illustrate that. If we go to experiments, jQuery append, here it is, right? We could say hello world, right? And we can keep appending. Is there anyone out there? Notice that we're calling append. Notice that we're putting it .append, right? So this is another feature I'd like to talk to you about. Whenever you call any of these functions, any of these jQuery functions, right? So $ is definitely a jQuery function, right? They all return, each one returns an instance of the object that is being manipulated. Okay? So for instance, $#hello returns jQuery's interpretation of the DOM of that piece, of that paragraph. Yes? And then it's an augmented object, right? So object that now all of a sudden has all these really cool functions that you can call on it, right? Such as append, right? So this is not a regular just paragraph, right? It's a jQuery paragraph, right? That you can then now manipulate, right? And you can call .append, which does what we just saw, right? It appends the text. But at the end of that append, once we call that append, that function returns again the object that is being manipulated. See that? And what it allows you to do is it allows you to string together several functions one after another, right? So maybe this syntax is a little hard to read, but basically this is doing this, right? .append, right? And then .append. You see that? Right. So the first one returns the object, which we're calling the first .append. Yes. And this first append returns the object again. As a return of this function, it returns the object that's being manipulated, so that we can again call .append on it. See that? Right. Now, if we and not only can we call append on it, we can call a whole bunch of other functions, right? Other jQuery functions, not only append, right? But here, a easier way to read this is to put them, to run them like this, right? So that they're much easier to read. Each function call in a separate line. Right? It makes it much easier to read. But indented, right? So that it's understood that these all apply to the first object that was referred to in the DOM. Make sense? Everybody okay? So if I save that and I go back and I refresh, if I refresh these, right? If I refresh this, refresh. Hello? Oh, I'm looking at the portal. So I haven't. So the portal has the old code, right? The portal has the old code. So we won't see that change here. All right. What else we have here? So we have append, right? So we have UL. Notice that UL, look what we're doing. First, we're grabbing a hold of the UL. Okay? Right, we're grabbing the whole UL. And now here is an example that instead of grabbing it, right, and then calling the functions right on it like we did earlier, right? What do we do here? We grab the DOM, right, and then we acted on it right away. Yes? But then after that line of code, we don't have a hold on the hello DOM anymore. Yes? If we want to grab the hello DOM again, we would have to again call $, hash hello if we want to grab it again. Yes? Instead, what we can do is call it, grab something from the DOM, right, and then store it in a local variable. See that? Right, that's what we're doing here. Right, we're grabbing something from the DOM, right, and we're storing it locally on a local variable. Right, now that we have it in a local variable, we can use it over and over, right, in that variable, right? So we can anytime we want to manipulate the UL elements, we can use the variable UL elements. You see that? Right? As opposed to just throwing it away, right? We are caching it here in this variable. Now this variable, now we can manipulate it here. We can pass it along to some function, yes, and that function can then manipulate and change whatever that DOM variable is referring to. Make sense? Right. So it's actually a good practice that to grab whatever you need, yes, and store it in local variables, right? Cache it there and do all your manipulation on the variables instead of always grabbing it new. Right? It's expensive, right? If you're grabbing something from the DOM, it's an expensive operation, right? Just like whenever you do a select, right? You have all these joins, right? When you're doing query in the database, those are all expensive, right? So whenever you have something and you have some data, use it as much as you can to optimize its use. Right? So same thing here, cache it, and then once you have it, you can then reuse it. So what are we doing here? Let's see. We're dynamically creating an LI. See that? We're dynamically creating an LI element. Notice that the $ function, the jQuery function, again, it's smart, right? In this line, it understands that the string is a CSS rule, right? Because that has that hash in front of it. See that? And it says, oh, you are grabbing something from the DOM, right? It's that UL that it's in the DOM, right? Down here, because we are giving it well-formed HTML, right? It understands that this is not a CSS rule; it's actual HTML, right? And the way this is interpreted, it says, "Oh, you want me to build this HTML, this DOM elements, right? Right? Okay, so I will create the DOM node, right, for an LI with content AngularJS. Yes, I have it in memory. It's not. I haven't added it to the actual document yet. Yes, it's only in memory, right? It's only in the variable LI. Yes, right. It's not rendered yet. I can't render it yet. Yes, only when I append it here, right? Only when I say, hey, UL elements, I have a new LI for you, and I want you to add it at the bottom, right, as the last LI element that you have already 3 LI elements, right? Java, Node, and C# maybe, right? I want you to add this brand new LI element that I just created. Once I add it to the UL, right, to an actual DOM element that already exists in the DOM, that's already been rendered. Once I add it to this, now it renders. Yes, right. So here, even though I created it, it's in memory. It does not yet render because it's not yet in the DOM. But when I append it to the DOM, now it renders. Make sense? Questions? All right. All right. Down below, I'm going to create another one. I'm going to create another LI. Okay. But notice now that LI is empty. Right? Yes.
How will the append, like the last UL element dot append of LI, will that know that I have to append this line like var LI before the UL tag? So like the course list as an UL, right?
This one grabs the UL.
Yeah, it has an UL.
Yeah.
So the var li should get appended before the the end of UL tag in the actual HTML.
Yeah, in the actual it gets appended at the end, right? So if there's 3 LIs, this will be the 4th LI.
How will the JavaScript will know that I have to append that before the end tag of UL?
So remember that the tags is only for us humans, right? To parse, right? Internally, these are all arrays and objects, right? And collections, right? The fact that we use opening tags and closing tags is for us humans to be able to read the HTML strings, or the HTML text, right? When it gets parsed, right, the way it interprets it is that I have a node that represents UL. There is no closing tags, right? The closing tag was for us when we were writing it, right? It's the way we understand it. But when it gets parsed, right, it says I have a UL node, right? And that UL node has a collection of LIs, right, as an array, right? And then and the append basically is doing is just taking that array, right, and adding a new elements to that array, right? Now in the DOM there are no such thing as pointy brackets or anything like that, right? That's an abstraction for us humans to write text, right? A browser. But when that gets parsed into an actual, RAM objects and instances and stuff like that. Okay, yeah. So what this does is just if this were Java and the LI were represented as an array list, right? It would take that array list and it would say dot append, right? And that would be added to the end of the collection. Yes, whatever language this might be written in, or C# or whatever, right? That makes sense. Yep. So here's another example where we're creating. Notice that we're reusing the same LI. Notice that we're reusing the same LI variable. You see that? We're using the same LI variable again. The first one, we used it to create, a well-formed LI with all the text inside, right? AngularJS, yes? This second one, notice that we're only creating the LI element, but we're not putting any text inside of it. See that? Right? I did that on purpose, right? Just to show you that this one creates the LI node empty. There's no text in it. There's no text node inside of the LI node. And we are appending text to the LI node that we just created. We just created the LI node. And we're appending text inside of LI. We could have used HTML here too. We could have said li.html and then MongoDB. We could have done that. Only because we're not going to append anything else. This is the entire content of that LI. It's just this MongoDB, right? Over here, there's the only content in there. So, but just to show you that we can manipulate. We can grab HTML, do a whole bunch of manipulations even before it gets rendered, right, and add it to be rendered in the DOM, right, in the browser. Not until we append the actual LI to the UL does this get rendered, right? Right here, when we append, is when the browser says, "Oh, the DOM has changed." Yes, I have to go back and re-render the page, right, or render that portion of the window. That makes sense, right? Here's yet another example. Right, we have here an array of strings, right, that represent names of students, right? So 4 students, A, B, C, and D: Alice, Bob, Charlie, and Dan, right? And here we're grabbing another UL. I'm sorry, an OL. Here we're grabbing this list over here, right? This over here, which is initially was empty. It's this list over here, right? We're grabbing that ordered list right there. We grabbed it. Now that we have it, we're going to iterate over that array. Right, here's the array, student names. As many as there are. That's why we have dot length there. and for each one, we're gonna create a brand new LI instance for each student that we have, and we're gonna grab the name, the current name from the array. Now that we have the name, we can append LI. We can append the student name to the LI we just created, and now that we have the LI with the text in there, we can append the line item to the list. Actually, no, look, we're not appending. What are we doing? We're prepending. What does that mean? We're adding at the beginning of the list, not at the end of the list. That's why, notice that we have the names, right? Alice, Bob, Charlie, Dan. Even though we're iterating forward, right? A, B, C, D, notice that the list renders in reverse order. You see that? Because Alice gets added first, Bob gets prepended to Alice. So now you have, so first is Alice, then we have Bob and Alice, and then Charlie, Bob and Alice, and then Dan, Charlie, Bob and Alice. See that? It's prepended, added at the beginning. Make sense? Now, there's quite a few other append functions, and I encourage you to look at all the other ones. There's tons of them, and first, as you're using these, kind of think of what it is that you want to do, how you want to manipulate it, right? And then just go through the API documentation and try to find methods that allow you to do this. Chances are that there is a function that allows you to manipulate it just in the way you want. There's another function that's very useful called the wrap function. Allows you to, whatever content you have, you can just wrap content around it. And you can make it, it says, I have this paragraph, this set of paragraphs. Ooh, I like to grab all of them and wrap them in a div. Now I want to put a div around it. So that's pretty cool, right? Being able to manipulate inside of it, at the end, at the beginning, in the middle, around it. It's very, very powerful. Allows you to tons and tons of really, really cool DOM manipulation functions. Yes.
So when we created the LI element for AngularJS, the one on the top.
Yeah.
So what if we did not add the ending LI tag?
Yeah.
Would it still work?
No, it would never render. It would never render. It only existed, right, briefly, right, in that variable.
Yep. And when we grab an ID into a variable,
yep,
using jQuery, do we need to do a null check on it, or is that done by jQuery?
So jQuery, when it doesn't find something, right, for instance, you misspell the ID or whatever, it returns as an empty array. Right, as an empty array. Huh?
It won't break anything. If
no, it won't break. Yeah. No, it won't break. Right. Which is a little frustrating. It says, why isn't this working? Right. It's not giving you any errors. And yes, you should always check to see if the array is empty. Right. Because what it does is that notice that which will a very, very cool feature is that as the name suggests, it's querying, and the match might match many elements. Over here, we're using IDs, right? So the idea is that these are unique identifiers, right? And these are unique elements that you're matching, you're pattern matching. But if you start using classes, for instance, right, you might match many elements, right? So match all my paragraphs. Well, there might be 20, 30, hundreds of paragraphs, right? So that returns not one element, it returns an array of elements, right? And jQuery is so smart that if you call a function on it, right, it will apply to all the elements that were matched, which is pretty cool, right? Or if you prefer to iterate over each one, you can do that too, right? You can grab one of them and then just say, I want to, dot each. Dot each allows you to iterate over all the elements that were matched, right? It might be just one, or there might be several elements that match your CSS rule, right? In this case, it's just we're using IDs, so yes, so they should only match one. But we'll see in a minute. When you use classes, there might be several, right? So we'll see examples on that. Yes.
Why their dollar sign is lost?
I'm sorry.
why there are dollar sign in the last, at the bottom of this square?
Why is Alice at the bottom
And on right,
here?
at the bottom, why there are dollar sign in the square? Like, yeah.
Oh, no, there's no need for it. But if you have different versions of jQuery, right, you can pass along the correct version of the jQuery, right? And then so you might pass a version of jQuery, and then internally you can rename. You can create another alias, right, internally here, right? So you might have a version called jQuery, 1.1, another one jQuery 0.9 or jQuery whatever, right? If you have different versions, and that would only exist within that namespace.
I can rename that bonus.
Yes, you can rename it to whatever you want. Yep. But in this case, we're not using that feature. Okay. Okay. All right, let's go to a click that, well, really, it's not just click, it's event handling in general. So jQuery provides a very, very simple event handling model, right? Meaning, how it allows you to declare, to bind events on HTML elements, right? And how to respond to those events, right? Using callbacks, right? And so here's a couple of simple examples where you can either click, right, and it invokes some function that gets invoked, or hello world here, and you can click on the save message, right? You can click. Actually, no, it says double click event. So only if you double click, it'll run it. So I'm double clicking, and now it runs. Or here, you can either hover over it. When you hover over it, it comes up, pops up. Or when you hover away, it says leave. It says goodbye. Yeah, so if you hover over it, it says goodbye. If you hover away, notice, well, actually, it says leave, or when you come in, it says enter. So it can detect whenever you come into an area or when you leave an area, right? So let's look at this example. So let's look at the source code. Oh wait, sorry. This is source code. I'm just going to put it here. So yeah, so down below, notice that we have a simple click event, and then we have button ID click BTN. See that? Click BTN over here, right? And as you guessed it, right? That ID, we're going to use that ID to refer to it from the jQuery side. Notice that we're also down below, we're declaring IDs for this input field. So this input field over here, we're declaring IDs for this double button over here. And down below, notice that we have another input, hover message, which is this input here. Oops. This input field here. And then we have a span, and we have an ID on it. It says hover event. You see that? Okay, we're going to refer to all these from the jQuery side. Okay. So let me open up the. Does that sound? All right, I was getting feedback. Let me make this a little smaller. Okay, and let me bring this over. And let me bring this, okay. And that's a source. Let me bring the source. There we go. Okay. All right, so what we're going to do here is all those IDs, we're going to grab them. So here's my button, right? My click button, there it is. From JavaScript, we're going to use jQuery to grab all those buttons. Right, there it is. Here's my first button. See that? Notice that I'm using CSS to grab the button. Your hash click btn. Right, now I have the button. Yes, I have the button, and what I want to do is associate an event handler on that button. If that button gets clicked, I want to be notified. Right? To do that, we call the .click function on it. Right? It says you have the button. .click is the event that I want to be notified by, and the .click function, like many jQuery functions, has two versions. If you don't provide an argument, what you're going to do is you're going to generate a click event on that button as if somebody had clicked on it. Okay? If instead you provide a function as an argument to the click function, what you're creating is an event handler. It's meaning that if someone clicks it, this function will be called. Okay? Notice that the function is an inline function. Notice that it's being declared right inside of the parentheses of the click. You know, first time I saw this was very disturbing, right? You know, a function inside of parentheses. What is that? This, okay, I understand that this is a function that is being called, right? It's being invoked on this object here, right? Whatever that returns, right? But right inside of the click, there's a function here, right? So it's an anonymous function. It has no name, or it needs no name, right? Because it's a throwaway function, right? Right, you give me the function, and that function will be invoked, right, whenever someone clicks on it, right? So whenever I click on that button, what happens? That function gets called. And what does that function do? It just says alert hello. Every time I click on it, that function is going to be invoked. Hello, hello, hello. Everybody okay with that? Again, it's a very disconcerting syntax, hard to read. Preferably, you would declare a separate function, right? A real function, and give it a real name, yes, and it makes it clear, right, what function gets called when. Also, the function can be reused, right? Someone else can call it, right? It's reusable. Here's another one, double click. In double click, we're grabbing a hold of the button that is called double click button. It's this one over here, right? It's this button right here, right? We're grabbing a hold of that button and we're saying double click, right? And then we're providing a function. Here's a function. There it is. See that? Notice that the function is still inside of the parentheses of the double click function. You see that? Right? Again, disconcerting syntax, but very, very common. This syntax is very, very common in JavaScript. So you should start become familiar with this syntax. Functions embedded inside of other functions like that as arguments to other functions, right? Again, I don't like the syntax. I would prefer this to have a separate function, right? And pass the name of that function to this double click function that makes it much more readable. Nevertheless, it's a very common syntax that you should become familiar. So anyway, so every time you double click on that button, this function gets called. What does it do? That function, right? First of all, it grabs the an element whose ID is double message, which is this one over here, right? There it is, double message. Right? It's grabbing that input field. It's grabbing the value of the input field, see that? And storing it in a local message variable. And then it's saying alert message. Yes? Right? Very good. Here's another one, hover. Right, so hover, again, it grabs the hover event, and the hover event is this one over here. It's this span over here. You see that? Meaning grab that span and associate a hover event. Now the hover event has actually can invoke two types of events. Either when you enter whatever area you want to hover, or when you leave that hover area. Okay. So it can generate two event handlers, right? It can notify us when one or the other happens, right? When you came into the area or when you left the area, right? So the hover allows you to declare two functions. Again, these two functions could be embedded, right? These could be inline functions like we did earlier, right? We could have the function right here, right? This function right in here, and then another one over here. That would make it really, really hard to read, right? Instead, right, I did something that I prefer, right? I declare the two functions down below. Here are the two functions. I call them hover enter and hover leave, okay? And then I pass them as arguments to the hover function, right? The first argument is to the function that will be called when you enter the hover area, and the other is a function that will be called when you leave the hover area, okay? So what these two functions do? Well, the two functions, well, first of all, notice that they take as arguments. They're taking something as arguments. I'm not passing any arguments, right? I'm not, right? But all these functions, all of them, the ones we saw earlier too, right? All these functions that we saw earlier, right? This one, this function over here, this function over here. Notice that they're not taking any arguments. See that? Well, we could have added an optional parameter in there. We could have added an optional parameter in there. That parameter, right, would be invoked, would be passed to us by click or double click or whoever is calling us, right, and would pass to us an object that represents the event, right, the context of the event, right. For instance, it would tell you, exactly where the mouse was, right, when the event occurred. It would send us also a timestamp. When did the event actually occur? It would tell us, links to the references to the actual elements, HTML element that generated the event. A whole bunch of information would be passed on to us. But here, in these two examples, we are ignoring that object. We don't want it. We don't need it. Okay? So this one is ignoring it. This one is ignoring it. But this one is not. These two are not. Well, actually, they are, right? The only thing we're doing with it is just we're writing it to the console. That's all we're doing. Right? We're writing to the console these events. We're not doing anything with it. But we could, right? Well, we could read the mouse, right, position if we need to. Instead, what are we doing? We're grabbing the message. So we're taking this this input field, right? We're taking this input field. We'll call it hover message. Notice that earlier we grabbed it, right? We grabbed it over here. We put it in a variable, and then inside of the function, we use it to grab the current text in that field. See that? And then we use it to alert. Same thing when you hover out. When you enter, we are prepending an enter text. See that? Enter string. But when you leave, we prepend leave. And then we just use the message right after it. Make sense? Right? So if I go back here, right, and we look at the console. So here's a console, and the console is, let me clear it. All right, so if I hover over it, notice as an event gets generated. See that event? That event gets generated, and we wrote it to the console, and there it is. When I leave, it generates another one, right? And we can peruse through the event object, and we'll notice, right, that it passes us all sorts of, very useful information that we can use to, understand the context in which this event occurred. For instance, it tells us whether in an alt key, whether the alt key was down or not, right? It's the alt key in our keyboard, right? So, for instance, if there any of the modifier keys were pressed, like the alt key or the control key or the shift key, right? It tells us if they were, selected, right? It tells us, the X and Y position of the mouse at the time that the event occurred, right? It tells us exactly what DOM element generated this event. Notice that if I hover over it, it tells us, yes, the span element whose ID is hover event. That one generated. Notice that if I hover it, it highlights it on the DOM, right? What else? The timestamp, when, at what time did this occur, right? Just lots and lots of information is in here. Okay. All right. Also, the type of the event. The type of the event is mouse over. These are native JavaScript events. Those are the native JavaScript events that generated this, right? What jQuery does is that it wraps around the underlying event handling system of JavaScript, right? And it gives us a cleaner, right? Consistent API across all browsers, right? And all versions of JavaScript. Well, I'm sorry, a wider, broader family of JavaScript versions. Does this make sense? Right? Pretty simple. Close that. Close that. Ajax. I don't know if I want to go into this. This is a pretty involved example. So again, well, let's do it. Let's see. Actually, let me see if it even works here in this network. If I call avatar, find movie. Okay, it does work. So here's an example on one of the things that jQuery shines on is that its ability to interact with web APIs, right? To very easily connect to servers out there, right, and retrieve data from sources, web services. In this case, I'm using an API, a free API that uses IMDb to retrieve movie information such as plot, titles, posters, who the cast was, reviews, a whole bunch of things, right? And notice that down below, right? I dynamically generated this content in a tabular format, and that the title is actually a URL. If I click on it, it opens up a separate page into IMDb for the page for this particular movie. Right? There's quite a lot of things happening. Let's go over it real quick. All right, let's see if I click on Avatar. This is one. Avatar 3. Wait, Avatar 2 is not out yet, right? I think that's come out next year. They already have an Avatar 3. Yeah. Avatar. So this is the page for Avatar. So let's look at the source code for this. So the source code, well, notice that this one did not follow the proper good practices of having the JavaScript elsewhere, right? I wanted this to be one single page that you could perhaps reuse on your own. So notice that it has $sign in it, and what it does is that it calls this init function here, and it associates a click event on the find movie button. Okay, so perhaps there is some movie button. I bet it's somewhere down here. There it is. It says, welcome to Ajax, right? And there is indeed a button with an ID find movie button, right? So that button, actually, let me. So that button is this button over here, right? It's this button that you have here, find movie down over here, right? It's this button over here. So this over here is this over here, right? So it says get movies. So get movies, right? Get movies. And Get Movies, notice that it's a hyperlink. You see that? And that hyperlink, right? If I click on it in a new tab, notice that what comes back from this, right? Notice that what comes back is one huge JSON object, right? This JSON object, it's actually a JSON array, right? As the square brackets suggest at the top. Now, what really comes back is just plain string, a plain string. There it is. This is what comes back. This is the raw string that comes back. Okay. Now, I installed here a plugin, a Chrome plugin that identifies this as JSON, and then gives me this nice JSON inspector, right? That allows me to collapse and peruse through this JSON. I suggest you do as well, right? Because you're going to be sending and receiving lots of JSON in this class, right? So this would be a good tool to have in your browser, whatever browser you're using. So in here, notice that it has this array has actually several objects, right? Notice that it has 5 objects, okay? And each object has several properties, right? Has a country's property, the director's property, the filming location's property, genres, languages, metascore, plot, all sorts of things in here, writers. Now, these are all properties of each one of the objects that comes back in the array. Okay, I specifically was interested in just a couple of these attributes, such as title, the plot. Here's a plot. Okay. And also I was interested in the URL poster. So this one in particular didn't have a URL poster, but it did have a URL IMDb. So I was interested in just a couple of elements inside of this object. Right? So which one is this? James Cameron. So this is Avatar 3. So no, I don't have information for that. So how about Avatar 2? Is this Avatar 2? Avatar? Yeah, here's Avatar with a plot. Right, it has a posters, right? Has writers, has IMDb, okay, and all these come from this URL over here, from generating this URL over here. See this URL? If I take that and I paste it here. You'll notice that this is a very long URL, okay? And the URL, notice that it goes out to www.myapifilms.com, right? And it has several parameters, right? Notice that it has a query string, right? The query starts here in the question mark, and then it provides several name value pairs, right? Title equal avatar ampersand, format equal JSON ampersand, AKA equals 0 ampersand, business equals something ampersand, right? These are all parameters that we're passing over to the IMDb URL, right? The URL parses these parameters, right? And it runs a query, okay? Right, so for instance, one of the parameters says the title I am searching for. I am searching for Avatar. That's what I typed in my input field. You see that? Right? Actually, that's the only thing I typed. I then took this long URL and I replaced the title with the avatar, whatever you typed, and then I sent a URL off to IMDb, and it comes back with a URL with JSON object. Now the JSON object that comes back, right? It comes back to this URL that I want here, and I can see the JSON. But what I really want to be able to do is take this JSON and programmatically parse through this JSON, right? I want to programmatically take this URL, generate a request, and then parse the request that comes back from IMDb, right? That's what I want to be able to do. To be able to do this, we're going to use what it's called AJAX, right? That allows me to asynchronously make JavaScript calls to APIs. Right? So the way this works is that as follows. So it works something like this. So here we have the here we have IMDb, right, in the cloud, and here's our server, and here's as our browser. Here's our browser, and here's our server, which in this case is Node.js, right? Right. So our HTML page is here, right? So this is our HTML. It gets downloaded to the browser, right? So now I have it locally running on my browser on my machine, right? And that in here I have JavaScript. I have some JavaScript in here, so some JavaScript. Inside of that JavaScript, I have some code that is going to use $.ajax. So Ajax, right, is it's an acronym, right, that became very popular. It's asynchronous JavaScript API for XML, right? It was a very common way to retrieve data from servers, right? We wanted to be able to have the ability to have to go off and connect to remote servers, either our own server or servers out there that might not be ours, right? And retrieve data, right? Make an HTTP request, right? And then a server, right, running inside of that cloud would parse our URL and our parameters, make a query to its local databases, right? Maybe do some additional manipulation of the source of the data, right? And then respond to us with, originally it was XML. XML was very, very popular. Well, it still is, right? It was a very popular data exchange format, right? It was text. It was plain text, right? Human beings could actually read it, right? It wasn't binary, as opposed to having something binary, some proprietary binary format. It was readable by human beings. Not that it was meant to be read by human beings, but nevertheless, it was easy to write, easy to parse. There's tons and tons of XML parsers out there, right? And certainly we wanted to have a mechanism to be able to send requests and receive data, right? Slowly has become more and more, JSON has become more a common data exchange format, right? Especially because in the browsers, JavaScript is a very common way to execute code, natively, and it's becoming more and more pervasive. It looks like as if JavaScript is taking over the world, right? Not only is it running on the client, it's running on the servers, it's running on the databases, it's everywhere. It's like slowly taking over the world. But nevertheless, it's the same acronym. Perhaps the X at the end is perhaps dated from when perhaps XML was more ubiquitous, even though it's still very ubiquitous. JSON is taking over. But nevertheless, Ajax allows us to provide as argument a URL, right? It provides us with callbacks, if it's successful. We can provide a function to call, right? And provide us with the data that comes back, right? So let's look at some of the code that will allow us to do this, right? So let's go back to our code. Oh, sorry, where are we? Here's the code. So here's our JavaScript. When we click on that button, basically we have a function here. When we click on the button, we go off and retrieve the title that you typed in the input field. Now that we have the title, we call another function called find movie by title. And we pass the title as an argument. See that? We pass the title as an argument, and we also pass as an argument a function, right? The function is called render movies by template, meaning here's a function somewhere down here. Where is it? Oh, there it is, render movies by template. So there's a function that taking an array of movies, it will render the movies, okay? Right? So let's look at the first piece. Now that we have the title, how do we go off and retrieve data? Right, let's look at that. So find movies by title. So here it is, find movies by title. Okay, it takes as argument the title that I type, avatar. Yes? What does it do? It dynamically creates a URL. Here's the URL. It's the same URL we looked at earlier. Where is it? Is it here? It's the same URL. See this URL? Right, it's the same URL. But instead of me typing it at the URL input box, instead I am creating a string out of it. There it is. It's a string. What am I doing with title? I am concatenating it to the string. You see that? Right? Once I have the URL, I use that URL as an argument to the AJAX function. jQuery's AJAX function. The AJAX function can take several things as arguments. One of the things is, where do you want me to get data from? You know, where URL do you want me to go fetch data from? Okay, and we do that by providing the URL argument. And here is the URL. Then another argument that it takes is the type. Okay, what data are you expecting to come back? What data is a string? What is going to come back? Is it HTML? Is it XML? What is it? Is it JSON? What data are you expecting to come back? Okay, it's actually JSON-P, but I'm not going to get into that just yet. Right? It's JSON, almost JSON, almost JSON. And finally, another method is another argument to the parameter to the AJAX function is, if the response is successful, what do you want me to do? Okay, well, what I want you to do is call this function. Here's the function I'm going to give you for you to as a callback, right? Notify me calling this function if it's successful. If you successfully retrieve data, right? And it passes me whatever the response is from that URL. Okay, and what we do is we turn around and we call back. We invoke the function that you passed us as an argument, and passing the response to that callback. Okay, and I know this is a little too much at the end, right? And we'll definitely go over this in much more detail when we come back in the next lecture. But just a peek. The function that we passed along was this function, the one that renders the template, right? Renders the movies by template, which is this one down here, right? Render movies by template, which presumably takes as argument the array of movies that came back, right? And then iterates over each movie, adding it as a table to the document. Anyway, let's leave it here. That's a little too much for now. Let's cover this in much more detail when we come back on Monday. All right. Anyway, thank you.
Oh, there's one question.
Yes. Any questions?
Is there any IDE that you could use to debug line by line charts?
Yes. WebStorm is the one that I'm using.
Okay. So we can
allows you to debug both client and server. Yep.